in performance management, we act as if the world is flat, and we are continue to kind of ignore the evidence that suggests that it's not flat. And a part of the central mythology, I think, of performance management is very much the nature of how you motivate and control performance in organizations, how you motivate and control employees in organizations, that it's not the flat earth metaphor is really very much a coercive kind of control model. Performance management is very much stuck in the past. The image here is intentional, that we are living in the dark ages in many ways. In performance management, we act as if the world is flat, and we ignore the evidence, and we don't challenge our assumptions and beliefs. So we'll talk a bit about the nature of kind of how that happened, what we should do differently, how we should think about performance management differently, what are better models and frameworks and practices. And to be clear, we've been at this for a long time. And I think the idea of a wicked problem, if many of you are familiar with that term, I think the idea of performance management as a wicked problem fits. You can see the definition. Everyone does it the same way. Everyone is unhappy. All the stakeholders are unhappy. And despite 70 years or more of study and tinkering, and extremely high costs and investment in the U.S., upwards, and the best estimates I can find are upwards of almost $350 billion, billion with a B, spent every year in merit, and bonuses are distributed based on this process. And by my guess, we get maybe nothing from that spend, and we may actually hurt ourselves for spending that amount of money. So lots and lots of study and tinkering and very little improvement, and very strong forces holding this in place. Those of you who've tried to change it know exactly what I mean. That there are very formidable dynamics that are keeping the status quo in place. And so the point of this is it's going to be very difficult to change. So for excuse me, for those of you who are kind of looking for low-hanging fruit here, there isn't any. This is going to be hard to actually transform. So we have to kind of be prepared for this kind of change. Okay. So let's kind of start at the beginning, which is where most of the problems are with performance management. What is performance management for? And despite what we say, despite what academics say, despite what companies say, and many of them say that, well, it does many things for a company, to help create direction and develop employees, make decisions about them, provide information, and so on. The real answer is it's really about one thing. It's about pay distribution and pay differentiation and reward distribution. This was the number one purpose in the research that Edie Goldberg and I did a couple years ago to prepare for a chapter that we wrote on performance management. Others, Willis Towers Watson's benchmarking work, World at Work's benchmarking work, all show that the primary purpose of performance management in organizations is reward distribution. The experts agree. I could have kind of put 5 or 10 quotes from important papers that people have written that all suggest, like this quote from a call for papers for a special journal focused exclusively on performance management that would provide kind of the newest and latest thinking. Even they, in fact, in their preparation for potential authors, suggested that we all know that performance management is in the business of evaluating and compensating employees. And it was very clear to me that they were not interested in entertaining any ideas that were contrary to that. So the problem with this is it constrains our thinking in terms of how you solve it. And so part of the question is, well, how did this happen? How did this, why is this the case, and how did this become the case? So a little history lesson, and we, obviously we don't have time to go into depth here, but um, where did the rise in pay for performance, kind of the marriage between performance management and rewards, come from? Where did that happen? How did that happen? And the reality is, the science has always been there. The theories that are behind all of these, pay practices and performance management practices have always been there, from classical kind of stimulus response psychology, and classical economics, and um, and the, early scientific management, and political philosophy around, are people basically bad or good? Most of the sense is they're mostly bad, they're mostly lazy, that we need incentives and threats and carrots and sticks to motivate them and align their interests with those of the company, and that behaviors, is a function of its consequences. So the job for performance management and rewards is to apply consequences. So that was part of it. It's always been there. But some other developments in the '80s, certainly in the U.S., but I would be very keen if others had insights into how these things happened in Europe. But um, many, in the '80s, there was a concerted effort begun to limit executive pay. And lots of these efforts through disclosure rules for proxy statements, disclosing the roles for the top 5 executives, and also tax law changes in the US in the early '90s that limited the deductibility of executive pay unless it was tied to performance. All of these things caused, in true fashion, attempts were to limit executive pay, but they had exactly the opposite effect. Pay for executives skyrocketed. The use of incentives for executives skyrocketed. So after these, efforts, we ended up with much higher salaries and much higher use of incentive pay, mostly through early on through stock options. And so tying executive pay to the performance of the company, in terms of stock price. So incentives, the use of incentives skyrocketed, and penetrated deep into the organization. Moving from maybe up to 3% of people's pay being based on variable pay to upwards of 13 to 15% now, and moving from, executive use of variable pay to almost everyone is subject to some kind of individual variable pay program now, certainly upwards of 90%. And it's important to understand and keep in mind how flawed a picture this is. I'll come back to that in a minute, but these theories on the left were based on a very different times, very different kind of industrial, even agricultural era organizations. And it's important to understand that the developments on the right, that incentive and variable pay and pay for performance didn't expand dramatically because it was effective. It expanded because if it was good for executives, it was good for everyone else, and it expanded because of limits, tax laws and regulatory reforms that failed. So this, what we have now is not the result of reasoned, sensible kind of judgments about what works. So it's important to keep that in mind. Okay. And so, as a result of these developments, performance management evolved, accordingly to fit this purpose. It was not, it's not surprising, not a coincidence, excuse me, that in the '90s, when, GE began using forced distributions. So, reward budgets became central. We had to manage costs, so we have to keep these budgets from being overspent. We need a forced distribution system and calibration to do that. Lots of focus on ratings. We can't get rid of ratings. It changed the feel for this process, and it dramatically increased the problems related to this process, related to the perception of unfairness, the perception of inaccuracy in ratings, and the dramatic perceptions, increase in perceptions of inequality in this process, and the inequality in the judgments that are driving this process. Okay. And so, this is a problem for us. Again, as I think Amy mentioned it at the beginning, the world is different now than it was in the 1930s, the 1920s. Basic from the industrial era, kind of assumptions and beliefs that are underpinning the model on the left. Performance management was really designed for that model, for a world that with very specific jobs, very simple jobs, routine jobs that remain kind of the same year to year, and where spans of control are small. We supervise. We can see everybody that reports to us. They're all in the same building, in the same office, and most of the people, excuse me, that are doing the work are people that we own. And it's a different world now, rapidly becoming a very different world where we're working in a more agile way. We're working more as teams than individuals. Jobs are much more complex now and much more dynamic. All the simple jobs have been outsourced and automated. So with large spans of control, much flatter organizations, and much tighter budgets. So we just don't have a lot of money to throw around for incentives. So the world is very different now, and science has kind of moved on from the model on the left to the model on the right, but very few in the business world. We're still very much living with the image of the world on the left, and so if we're going to make a change, we're going to have to adopt practices and assumptions and beliefs and theories that match the world on the right, if we're going to be effective in really changing things. And then, so the question is, what do we change to if this doesn't work? And so one of the ways, I think one of the ways of looking at this process, we need to kind of step back and reframe what this process is designed for, and ask the question, what purpose does performance management serve for organizations? And using an organization design lens, and this is just a picture of a fairly popular organization design model from McKinsey, the 7S model. And if we use an organization design lens to look at this, there's a kind of a bucket here that talks about systems and processes. That includes both the horizontal processes, that workflow processes, but also the management and control processes that sit on top of the kind of the horizontal work processes. These are mostly management and control processes, decision processes like budgeting and financial controls, business planning, prioritization processes, audit processes, governance. So it's, the question is, how do we get people to pay attention to the right things and not pay attention to the wrong things? And PM is a very performance management, and really reward programs in general are kind of classic control processes. Control used in a kind of a non-evaluative way. I mean, organizations need control systems in order to function in the organization. And so the question is really, how do we, what mechanisms, and how do we, direct attention? How do we motivate? How do we encourage individuals to act in ways that benefit the company? And in the past, we've had a traditional way of kind of answering that question. And in general, what we find, and when you look at the management control literature, there's really a couple of different approaches to control. One is coercive control, which is a traditional, is organizations' traditional go-to strategy for control. And those of us who've lived in large organizations know the mechanisms of coercive control well: hierarchy, formal processes, written processes and procedures, chain of command, management directives, centralized decisions, very formal roles and responsibilities. And these, so the approach is always kind of restrictive and codified and prescriptive, and classic kind of carrot and stick control systems, performance management systems linked to extrinsic rewards are all classic coercive control strategies. And I think about 90% of the research done on control systems is done on coercive control systems. So, and the sense is from the research in this area that these are not effective. They're based on old thinking, old methodologies, old models, outdated, and we need to change them. And the advantage of a kind of a control systems um, um, frame here is we actually have an alternative. That's part of the problem with performance management when you think about the classic kind of performance management through ratings serving pay for performance systems, is that there isn't an alternative. It's difficult to conceive of an alternative to that, framing performance management in terms of rewards. How else would you do it? And so I think the advantage of a control system kind of view here is that you have an alternative, that the researchers call enabling control. And so the advantage here is, this is a much lighter touch to control, much more reliant on more psychological and sociological kinds of mechanisms. These are things that are making a strong comeback in organizations: focus on purpose and meaning, belonging, relatedness, autonomy, mastery, and competence. So using those kind of deeper, more durable needs to help to help direct and control how individuals behave in organizations, and also kind of classic things like creating the right kind of culture and organization design, and creating high context and high transparency, so it's very clear what we're trying to achieve, so people can make their own choices in alignment with what the organization needs. And these approaches have been around since the late 60s, early 70s, much less popular in organizations, and are much more aligned with the future of work. And this is the kind of the mandate in this area of study, is that we have to abandon these control mechanisms and processes on the left because they don't work. They're based on old thinking. They don't match the requirements and demands that we're facing now, which is much more complicated work, much more team-based work, larger spans of control, difficult to supervise everybody, and half the people working for you, working on the things that you're doing, don't report to you, or aren't even owned by the organization anyway. So this is a much more sensible way to think about control in the future. And one of my favorite quotes, I think, just kind of perfectly captures the essence of enabling control. And in the book I wrote, I actually use this as the kind of the beginning chapter quote, I think, for the goals chapter. But this is very much the traditional way to do this would be to put in place an incentive system or a piece rate system, paying people by the amount of wood, and by the progress of kind of building the boat. But this is not what enabling control is about. It's about painting the picture and helping people understand what we're up to, what we're trying to achieve, getting them to internalize those goals, and then turning them loose to get it done. And so we need to do things differently. We need different models, different frameworks. This is a model that Edie Goldberg and I created again for this chapter we just wrote. So it kind of starts with, it starts with the name change. And a lot of people, I think, are including Betterworks and others, are seeing the value of thinking about this differently. That people's performance doesn't need to be managed from the outside. That it needs to be enabled. So this needs to be about thinking about performance management and performance enablement in terms of, at the front, talking about the basic purpose of kind of providing direction, providing alignment, and providing support in the service of performance. So this brings performance back in instead of having it on the sideline behind rewards. And so this model kind of starts with a foundation of context and direction that goals and line of sight provides, and then focuses heavily on enabling performance rather than controlling it, evaluating it, and incenting it through coaching and feedback and the kind of support that people need to make progress against the goals they've got. And then and development is a critical piece of this. You can't have long-term sustained performance without development, especially in a world where the half-life of skills is, a year or 2 years or 3 years. And then the other idea of this idea of the spiral nature of this, that kind of ongoing day-to-day enabling performance kind of helps build people's kind of self-concept, their increases their resources, increasing their confidence and self-efficacy, gives them the capabilities they need to continue to perform, at a high level, kind of day after day, building resources and this upward kind of virtuous spiral that helps people lean in, helps them take on more responsibilities. And it can also add, if not done well, and this is what we see in organizations now, is that it's also a vicious cycle where people, progress gets blocked. They don't get what they need in terms of help and support and feedback, and people begin to kind of, fall into more of a resignation and resentment pattern. They kind of spiral down, lose energy, lose commitment, and performance and motivation suffers. So we need different models, and we need practices like these on the right, that much more goal centric, much more continuous. This has to be done and embedded in the flow of work through our meetings, and especially at the team level. Much more focus on positivity and helping people make progress, and much simpler documentation, simpler technology, and then heavy manager support to get this work done. So this we need something very different than what we have now. Something very much embedded in the flow of work and not separated in terms of time and specific events, and not connected to pay. And so what you see that's missing here is all the bad stuff that we have to get rid of: ratings, individualistic pay for performance programs, and so on. And then one last slide, just to address kind of the elephant in the room. Well, what do you do with rewards, in all of this? And the answer is, I mean, it is difficult to reform performance management without reforming rewards. And so the idea is, we certainly need to disconnect them, but in many ways, disconnecting them is what a lot of organizations do. In time, they separate compensation from performance management in time, but they don't divorce them in terms of purpose. We need to divorce them, not just disconnect them. And really, we need to manage compensation without pay for performance and differentiation. And we need to motivate without money. And part of the way you do that is, well, I mean, it's four things. So it's pay people well. So, and think base and think market there instead of variable pay and incentives. And we need to grow people's pay over time. We need to give people market-based pay increases, give them cost of living increases, and promote them more quickly. Much more narrow banding allows more promotions, grow their pay that way. Pay the person rather than the position. And then also share the wealth. Much more focus on organizational incentive programs rather than individualistic kind of incentive programs: profit sharing, gain sharing, stock ownership. And then heavy investment in all the things we matter to people that are not financially related, like recognition and appreciation, like learning and development. People really want to get better. Let's give them access to all the learning and development opportunities they need. give them access to special assignments and lateral moves that really grow their skills and develop them. There are lots of things that people want that are not necessarily financially related. So, in the end, I mean, we have to reform rewards as well as performance management. And again, it's going to take time. It's going to be hard. But if we want to make performance management uh, um, into a tailwind instead of a headwind, these are the things we're going to have to do. So that's it. If you want more, there's certainly more you can read from me. And if we have some time, we can go back and entertain questions.
We had lots of questions. In fact,
sure.
I've done a few of these, and I don't think I've ever seen so many questions. So it's good. I think we've got time maybe for one before we get to Andrea's section. And there was a lot of chat, as you can imagine, about the not differentiating comp. Lots of comments on that, which you can read through. One of the ones that a few people kind of wanted you to elaborate on was, what is the recommendation around this? Are you suggesting don't differentiate on comp? So you covered some of that in the last slide, but perhaps just chat a bit more on that.
This is maybe the most important point, is that, I mean, the answer is and I've lived in organizations my entire career. I am not, despite what I say, I am not delusional. I do understand what this takes. The answer is we should still differentiate between employees based on base pay. And the key is to differentiate based on things that are legitimate and are perceived by employees as legitimate. People's credentials, the amount of experience, all those things we're going to treat people differently based on base pay, based on the market for their skills that they have and their position. But what we have to get away from is differentiation, and more radical differentiation based on individual factors like performance ratings that are terribly inaccurate, terribly unreliable, terribly unfair. And so the key is to differentiate based on things that are much more legitimate. And so and to reduce the amount of differentiation based on individual performance factors, because we don't measure those very well, and they're much more difficult to justify. And it's much more difficult to defend.
Great, thank you for that. We've got so many more questions, and I've noted them all down in case we have time later, because Alan will be back for our panel discussion. So Alan, have a read through the chat and feel free to engage. I know Bruce and Mihai have been commenting on some of the questions. So thank you so much.
Just one note. I feel free to reach out to me. This is really important to me. So reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to kind of enter into a conversation about these topics.